I'm Elaine Hastings, 71 years old, and the last time I sat down to dinner at my daughter's house, I left with nothing but my coat, a journal, and the sting of her fingers tangled in my hair. She didn't shout. She didn't throw anything, but the way she leaned in and whispered, "Not in front of my kids," made it clear who she thought I was. Now I stepped outside into the cold, with no wallet, no phone, no plan. And for the first time, I understood something that had been building quietly for years. She didn't love me. She loved what I could give her. By the time I reached the corner, I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't be going back before we go on. Tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from, and if you've ever had to start over from nothing, I hope you'll hit that like and subscribe button. I grew up in a town where the sidewalks cracked and the screen doors never quite latched right. My parents were steady people. My mother taught piano from our living room, and my father fixed watches down on 4th Street. Nothing fancy but enough. We said grace before dinner, helped neighbors without being asked, and believed in showing up even when it was inconvenient. I married George when I was 22. He was solid, quiet, and carried everything in his hands before he said a word. We had one child together, a daughter named Rachel. She came a little later than most kids do, and by then, I had the patience to let her bloom her own way. She was bright, sharp, a little restless. She loved big gestures and dreamed in full color. We raised her with everything we knew. How church on Sunday service. Before self-save, what you can give, what you can spare. When George passed suddenly from a heart attack, Rachel had already started a family of her own, her husband. Jason worked in insurance. They had 2 kids, Emma and Jacob, sweet things, loud and full of questions for a while. It was just me in the old house learning how quiet a kitchen can be when no one's asking what's for dinner. Then Jason died 5 months ago, and everything changed. Rachel called one morning, her voice thin and shaking. She said she couldn't sleep, that the nights were too long, that the house felt too big. She asked me to move in just until she found her footing. "It's not like you have anyone else, Mom," she said. "I'll take care of everything." I didn't argue. I packed up my things and left the home. George and I had built together. I told myself it would be temporary. I told myself it was family. At first, it felt like I was doing something useful again. I folded laundry, helped with the kids, picked up groceries, when Rachel forgot. But slowly things began to shift. She said she'd handle the bills just to keep things simple, she suggested, combining our bank accounts for ease. Took my phone to add it to her family plan. Then one day, my mail stopped arriving. She said she'd just rerouted it so nothing would get lost. I missed Sunday service for the first time in years. Pastor Grant called once Rachel told him I wasn't feeling well. I hadn't asked her to. I never got the chance to explain. One afternoon, I said, maybe I'd call Joan from the prayer circle. Rachel didn't even look up from her laptop. She just said, "You don't need people who only check in when they need prayers." Mom, and that was the end of that. By the time I realized how much control she had taken, I couldn't even remember the last time I'd logged into my bank account without asking for help. So when I finally asked her at dinner about my missing debit card, it wasn't just a question. It was a test. And Rachel failed it spectacularly. Her hand in my hair wasn't rage. It was ownership. And I knew it when I reached the shelter that night. The receptionist didn't recognize me. At first, I must have looked like a ghost. I told her I wasn't broken, just starting over. The room they gave me was barely bigger than a hallway closet, but it was mine. I locked the door, sat down on the edge of the bed, and pulled out the leather-bound journal I'd grabbed before walking out. I opened to a blank page and wrote, Day 1, and then I started to remember everything. That first night in the shelter, I lay awake, listening to the soft hum of voices down the hall, the steady drip of rain outside the window, and the quiet rustle of my own heart. trying to make sense of where I'd landed. My room was little more than a narrow cot, a chipped dresser, and a thin curtain that didn't quite close over the frosted glass. But it was safe, and for the first time in months, no one could open my door without asking. I pulled my old leather journal from the tote bag and tried to write what happened, but the words came slow, each one heavier than I expected. I wrote about Rachel's grip in my hair, about Emma's wide eyes, Jacob's fork still in the air, and the way the world went silent before I even left the table. I wrote, and I waited for the tears to come. When they finally did, I wiped them away with the back of my hand and started a new page. Trust in the wrong hands is a weapon. I set the pen down and listened to the rain until morning. Breakfast at the shelter was coffee in paper cups and oatmeal with raisins served by a woman in a flowered apron who offered a tired smile. I nodded my thanks and tried to eat, but nothing tasted right. I kept thinking about the last meal at Rachel's, how normal it had all seemed before I opened my mouth and asked that question. The shelter director, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Lewis, stopped by my table. He asked if I was comfortable, if there was anything I needed, and if I'd ever thought about seeing a legal advocate. "It's just a resource," he said, sliding a pamphlet over. "You never know what might help." I folded it up and tucked it into my bag. I tried to keep my hands busy that day. I helped set tables for lunch, folded towels, listened to two women argue over a crossword puzzle. But my mind kept circling back to Rachel. Her voice, her smile, the way she'd slipped so easily from daughter to warden. By late afternoon, I found myself at a desk in the shelter's office, surrounded by stacks of printer paper and the sharp scent of toner. The young attorney on duty was named Ms. Bryant. She greeted me gently and handed over a stack of intake forms. "Take your time," she said, but I didn't need much. I wrote down everything I could remember: my missing debit card, the mail that no longer came, the joint accounts, the phone she'd taken to set up the family plan, the passwords that no longer worked unless I asked her first. When I finished, I passed the papers to Ms. Bryant. She read them slowly, her expression never changing, then asked, "How long has this been going on?" I paused. "Since Jason passed," I said, then corrected myself. "But I think honestly, it started before that." She nodded, not surprised. "Do you have any proof?" "Anything in writing, any records?" I swallowed. "A journal, some screenshots, a few printed emails. I don't have them with me, but I can get them." She nodded again. "That's more than most. Let's start there." On my way back to my room, I caught my reflection in the glass of a vending machine by the elevator. My hair was still mussed from the night before, my eyes red and tired, but my face was my own. I'd lived through harder things, I reminded myself. I'd balanced church budgets, sat with grieving families, buried a husband. This wasn't the end. It was only a beginning I hadn't asked for. The next morning, I made a call from the payphone in the lobby. My hands shook as I dialed the bank, only to be told my account was locked due to multiple incorrect login attempts. "Would you like to reset your password, ma'am?" the automated voice asked. I hung up before I could answer. Later, the shelter director offered to help me access a computer in the resource room. I spent an hour fighting with old passwords, trying to get into my email, but every time I thought I had it, another roadblock appeared. Finally, I managed to reach a backup account I hadn't used in years. What I found there made my stomach turn cold: a notification of a wire transfer more than $11,000 to a Tesla dealership. My name, my account, my money. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. Another email, this one from a law office, confirmed a change to the beneficiary structure of the trust Jason set up for me before he died. Rachel's name now appeared next to mine as co-trustee. She'd done it quietly, slipped the papers in with a stack of others at the kitchen table, asking for my signature while she refilled my tea. I sat back in the hard plastic chair, staring at the walls, the knot in my chest growing tighter. I wrote it all down, every detail, every number I could remember. I knew then this wasn't just a misunderstanding. Rachel had planned it. She'd waited until I was tired, lonely, and vulnerable. She'd taken what Jason left me to protect and turned it into her own personal fund. That night at dinner, I sat with Margaret, an old friend from church, who now lived in a condo a few bus stops away. She brought out her good china-poured tea and listened without interrupting. When I finished, she set her cup down, looked me in the eye, and said, "Elaine, silence doesn't mean you're guilty, and love isn't something you owe. What Rachel did was a choice. You didn't deserve it." I nodded, letting the words settle. Before I left, Margaret pressed my hand and whispered, "Don't let her steal your stillness." The next few days blurred together calls to the lawyer, trips to the notary digging through files, gathering anything that might prove what had happened. I learned how to print emails, take screenshots, save voice messages. I signed forms, asked questions, and followed every instruction Mr. Everett, the lawyer, gave me. "If she tries to move any more money, call me first. Don't confront her. Just document and call." His words became a kind of shield. I kept a folder with everything, receipt statements, a USB drive labeled Rachel Evidence. One afternoon, I noticed a flyer on the bulletin board in the shelter lobby. Tech for seniors, learn how to recover deleted messages and protect your privacy. Something made me stop and write down the date. At the workshop, a young woman showed us how to access backup files and recover old texts. I listened carefully, asked questions after everyone else had left. Back in the shelter, I borrowed a laptop and followed her instructions. Soon, I was scrolling through lists of deleted messages, call logs, voice notes. I heard Rachel's voice, faint but clear. "She's old. She doesn't need the money. I deserve some of it." Another message. "If she starts poking around, I'll just tell the neighbors she's slipping." Each word felt like a stone in my chest. But I downloaded everything I could find, saved it on the USB, and hid it deep in my tote bag. That night, sitting by the window in the shelter common room, I watched the headlights pass along the wet street and pressed my palm to the blue plastic of that USB drive. Everything Rachel had ever dismissed in me, my memory, my routines, my careful way with details, had become the very thing she never saw coming. She thought I'd break, but I was still here. A few days later, a thick envelope arrived at the shelter for me. Inside was a notice from the court, a petition for conservatorship filed by Rachel, claiming I was no longer fit to manage my own affairs. Her affidavit was full of half-truths that I forgot names wandered off, accused family of theft. She wanted the courts to believe I was lost, confused, in need of protection from myself. But I read every word, then copied the entire file and made 2 extra backups, one for Mr. Everett and another for a post office box I'd opened under a different name. That night, I lay in bed, the envelope under my pillow, and listened to the slow, steady rain. Rachel had always been good at keeping up appearances, but now she was willing to erase me completely to keep what she'd taken. She didn't know I had proof. She didn't know I wasn't alone. As I closed my eyes, I promised myself I would not let her finish what she started. And for the first time in a long while, I believed I could stop her. The morning after the conservatorship papers arrived, I woke before dawn, the shelter quiet, except for the distant clatter of carts in the kitchen. I sat up slowly and looked around my small room, the thin blanket still tucked around my knees. It struck me how a single envelope could weigh more than all the years I'd carried since George passed. My hands shook as I reached for my journal. I wrote down everything I could remember, dates, conversations, every strange look Rachel had given me since Jason died. My handwriting wavered, but the words kept coming. After breakfast, I found myself back at the shelter's resource desk, the scent of bleach and coffee in the air. Mr. Everett had called the night before and told me to come by his office with everything I could gather. I packed my journal, the court petition, and the USB drive deep in my tote, zipped my coat, and headed out into the chilly morning. It felt strange walking the same route I'd once taken to choir practice now, with each step heavier, more careful. Mr. Everett greeted me with a gentle nod. His office was small, but orderly stacks of folders lined up along the wall, a photograph of a family picnic tucked between law books on his desk. He asked how I'd been sleeping. I said I managed, and he didn't push. Instead, he opened a yellow notepad and asked me to tell him everything again, this time aloud. The story spilled out. Rachel combining our accounts, the missing mail, the sudden change in my access to money, the transactions I'd never authorized, the trust amendment I didn't understand. When I described the conservatorship notice, Mr. Everett's jaw tightened just a little. He looked through the files, reading each page with quiet patience, and finally said, "This is going to take time, but you've done everything right. We'll file a motion to contest, but we'll need more evidence. Do you feel safe where you are?" I nodded, and he wrote down the shelter's address. His brow furrowed in concentration. Back at the shelter, the afternoon sun was bright against the lobby's tile floor. I watched women come and go, some talking in pairs, some quiet and alone. I waited for my turn at the community computer, thinking about the tech workshop I'd attended just days before. When the computer finally booted up, I followed the notes I'd scribbled during the class, my fingers stiff but steady on the keyboard. It took patience, but eventually I found my way into a folder of backup files, old messages, deleted voicemails, even photos I'd forgotten I had. As I listened to each file, Rachel's voice filled my headphones, her words sharp and careless. "She doesn't even use that money. I'm just doing her a favor." Another quieter. "If she starts asking questions, I'll tell people she's confused." Each new file I downloaded made something inside me shift. I labeled everything, creating folders, one for emails, one for texts, one for voicemails. Every scrap of evidence, every careless word, every digital receipt. I took my time reviewing each file twice, saving copies to both the USB and an old flash drive Margaret had loaned me. I felt tired, but for the first time in weeks. It was a useful kind of tired, the kind that comes from working towards something that matters. Margaret called later that evening, asking if I wanted to join her for dinner. We ate on her tiny balcony, the breeze cool, the scent of rosemary drifting from her kitchen window. She listened quietly as I explained what I'd found, her eyes never leaving my face. "You always were the careful one, Elaine," she said. "Don't let her make you doubt yourself." We sat there until the stars appeared, neither of us saying much more, but the silence between us felt like comfort, not emptiness. Days passed in a slow rhythm. I visited Mr. Everett's office regularly, dropping off copies of emails and letters, giving statements, signing forms I barely understood. He explained each step in a calm, even voice. "We'll request a freeze on the trust," he told me. "We'll challenge the conservatorship with a physician's evaluation. The most important thing is to keep documenting everything, no matter how small." I followed his advice, recording notes every night before bed, backing up each new detail twice. At the shelter, I grew familiar with the routine, the breakfast line, the polite nods from other women, the small kindnesses exchanged in the laundry room. In the evenings, I sat by the window watching headlights pass along the wet street, my journal open in my lap. Some nights, I listened to the recordings again, not out of anger, but to remind myself I wasn't imagining what happened. Each piece of proof was a small shield, something solid to lean on. One morning, I received a message from the bank about a pending transaction, a department store purchase I hadn't made. I printed the alert, added it to my folder, and tried to push away the worry. Mr. Everett had explained that as long as the investigation was active, Rachel wouldn't be able to move large sums without notice. Still, every new alert made my heart skip. On the day of my physician's exam, I dressed carefully and caught the bus to the doctor's office, clutching my folder close. The nurse asked me a string of questions, polite but pointed. The doctor, a man with silver hair and gentle eyes, had me draw a clock name, the president repeat a list of words. When I finished, he patted my hand. "You're sharper than most people half your age," he said with a small smile. He signed a form, tucked it into an envelope, and handed it to me. "This will help your lawyer." That night, back in my small room, I opened the envelope and read the doctor's statement 3 times. No evidence of cognitive impairment, capable of managing own affairs. The relief was quiet but steady. I tucked the letter between the pages of my journal and slept soundly for the first time in weeks. The next day, I stopped by Margaret's condo with a bag of fresh bread. She hugged me at the door, and we sat on her couch, drinking coffee, the news from the doctor open on the table between us. Margaret read it slowly, then looked up. "You're almost there, Elaine. Just keep going." Walking back to the shelter in the afternoon sunlight, I felt something lift. Rachel's voice, her accusations, the cold look in her eyes, they all felt farther away. I still had a long fight ahead, but now I had proof and the law on my side. As I let myself in through the shelter's front door, the world outside felt bigger, steadier, like something I could stand on again. I sat at my small desk that evening, sorting papers, stacking folders, double-checking. Everything was backed up. Outside, the rain had stopped, and I could hear distant laughter from the common room. I put the pen down, closed the journal, and let the quiet settle around me. Tomorrow, I would meet with Mr. Everett again and hand over the last of my evidence. Tomorrow, the next part of the fight would begin. But tonight, I let myself rest, ready for whatever Rachel tried next. Mr. Everett's office was quiet the next morning, sunlight slanting through the blinds onto a desk scattered with legal pads and half-drunk coffee. He welcomed me with a nod and took my folder, flipping through each document with a kind of measured focus that steadied my nerves. We reviewed the doctor's letter together, and he slid it on top of the growing stack of evidence. "This will help contest the conservatorship," he said. "But we're going to need the court to see the whole pattern. Not just the claim against your mental health, but what's happened to your finances, too." He outlined the next steps, his voice even, and patient contest, the petition freeze activity on the trust request, a full financial review, and alert the authorities if needed. He made copies of the emails, the voice messages, and the bank alerts I'd gathered. When we finished, I thanked him for his time, slipping my coat back on as I left the office. The city air was brisk and carried the faint scent of baking bread from the shop on the corner. And as I walked back to the shelter, I tried to picture how Rachel might react when she realized she no longer had the only voice in the room. That afternoon, I joined Margaret for tea at her kitchen table. We sat in silence for a while, the old radio playing softly in the background. Margaret set her teacup down and looked at me, her hands folded gently in her lap. "You always gave Rachel the benefit of the doubt, even when no one else would," she said. I nodded, watching the steam curl from my own cup. Margaret reached across the table, her hand warm on mine. "It's not weakness to love your child, but it's not weakness to protect yourself either." I took comfort in her words, letting the quiet linger before I walked back out into the late afternoon. Back at the shelter, I made another copy of the USB drive, labeling it in careful block letters, then slipped it into a small envelope I addressed to Mr. Everett's office. I mailed it at the post office across from the bus stop, then tucked the receipt in my wallet. It felt like placing a stone on a new foundation, each piece of proof one step closer to the life I needed back. 2 days later, a heavy envelope arrived for me at the shelter's front desk. The receptionist handed it over with a sympathetic smile. I opened it in my room, the pages crackling under my fingers. Inside was a notice for a court hearing. Rachel's petition for conservatorship would be heard the following week. The documents included a thick affidavit statements from Rachel and a list of her claims: confusion, forgetfulness, inability to manage my affairs, risk of harm to myself. I read every page steady and slow, making notes in the margin as I went. The words were cold, clinical, and full of holes. But the last page hit the hardest: a request for temporary emergency authority granting Rachel full access to my accounts if the court found her claims credible. I set the papers aside and stood by the window, the city evening pressing close on the glass. I let myself breathe slow and deep and turned to my journal, writing out each point I wanted to challenge. In the days that followed, I met with Mr. Everett several more times. We prepared for the hearing, reviewing the timeline of events and organizing every bit of evidence into neat labeled folders. He scheduled meetings with a forensic accountant and filed motions to halt any further changes to my financial accounts. He explained the importance of documenting each step, every withdrawal, every email, every interaction with Rachel or her attorney. I followed his instructions, double-checking every file before bringing it in. The shelter staff offered support in quiet ways. Mrs. Riley, who managed the kitchen, set aside an extra piece of fruit for me in the mornings. The night attendant slipped a small card of encouragement under my door. Even in a place where most folks kept their stories close, kindness managed to find its way through. I tried to hold on to those small mercies as the court date drew closer. On the morning of the hearing, I woke before sunrise. I dressed carefully, smoothing the creases from my skirt and tying my scarf just so. The city was still waking up as I rode the bus downtown, my folder clutched tight in my lap. At the courthouse, Mr. Everett met me outside, his presence steady and reassuring. We walked in together, our footsteps echoing off the marble floor. The courtroom was cool and impersonal, the air tinged with the faint smell of paper and dust. Rachel sat across from me at the petitioner's table. Her hair styled her suit, pressed her eyes, never meeting mine. Her attorney shuffled papers, whispering in her ear. The judge entered, and everyone rose. The hearing began with Rachel's attorney outlining her claims. Words like deteriorating memory, emotional distress, risk to herself and others. The judge listened, taking careful notes. When it was Mr. Everett's turn, he presented the physician's evaluation. My journal's copies of the bank records and the USB with voice messages and emails. He explained how the timeline of events didn't match Rachel's claims, and how the trust amendments and financial changes occurred after Rachel gained access to my accounts. The judge asked for clarification on several points. I answered each question steadily, recalling details from my journal, producing records where needed. At one point, Rachel's attorney objected, questioning the authenticity of the USB recordings. Mr. Everett responded with evidence showing how each file had been created and stored. The hearing lasted most of the day. By late afternoon, the judge announced that she would take all evidence under advisement, issuing a temporary freeze on my accounts and requiring an independent evaluation before any changes could be made. Rachel's attorney requested emergency access in the meantime, but the judge denied it, stating that the evidence presented raised serious concerns about Rachel's motives. Rachel's face remained unreadable, her eyes fixed on the table. After the hearing, I stepped outside into the cooling air, the courthouse steps wide and empty in front of me. Mr. Everett joined me, offering a gentle, "You did well today." I nodded, my hands loose at my sides for the first time in weeks. We walked to the corner, the city lights flickering on as dusk settled in. When I returned to the shelter that evening, Margaret was waiting for me in the lobby, a small bouquet of daisies in hand. She hugged me close, no words needed. Upstairs, I sat at my desk, pulling out my journal one last time before bed. I wrote about the courtroom, the judge's steady gaze, Rachel's silence, and the way the evidence felt like a wall finally being built around what was left of my independence. Tomorrow would bring the next step, an independent audit, more meetings, more patience required. But as I closed my journal and settled into bed, I knew I'd done everything I could. And for the first time since Rachel's hand tangled in my hair, I let myself hope that the tide was beginning to turn. The day after the hearing, I woke with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in months. There was still a lot to be done, but now the wheels were turning in the right direction. After breakfast, I spent the morning going over my notes, checking every folder and USB drive twice, making sure nothing had been missed. Mr. Everett called just before noon. His voice was steady as ever. "We're going to request a formal audit of the trust and all connected accounts. The court has agreed to an independent review, and we've filed to freeze any further withdrawals." I thanked him and wrote down the dates he mentioned, careful to mark each appointment on the shelter's calendar. Margaret met me for lunch at a quiet cafe around the corner from the courthouse. She wore a soft green sweater and a pin I recognized from years of church potlucks. We ordered soup and sandwiches, and as we ate, she squeezed my hand across the table. "You always kept everyone's books in order," she said. "If anyone can show the truth, it's you." I smiled and nodded, feeling stronger with her beside me. That afternoon, I rode the bus to the branch bank where my old accounts were held. The teller recognized my name and led me into a small office at the back. There, I explained what had happened about the frozen accounts the court ordered the missing funds. She listened carefully and printed out statements for every transaction made over the last year. I sorted through each page, highlighting any withdrawal or purchase I didn't recognize. The largest was the Tesla payment, but there were dozens of smaller charges, too. Department stores, electronics, online transfers. I took my time marking each one, then tucked the stack of statements into my bag before heading back to the shelter. Evenings at the shelter had taken on a rhythm. After dinner, I'd sit at the corner table in the common room with my journal and a mug of tea, reviewing the day and writing down anything new I remembered. Other residents would pass by sometimes, stopping to chat, sometimes just nodding in quiet solidarity. Mrs. Riley, the kitchen manager, liked to bring an extra cookie or fresh fruit, always setting it down with a smile. "You're almost there, Elaine," she'd say. "Don't stop now." The audit began the following week. 2 women from the accounting firm arrived at the shelter, introducing themselves with business cards and warm handshakes. We sat together in one of the meeting rooms, documents spread across the table in neat piles. They asked questions about each account, each transfer, every change in the trust's structure. I answered carefully, referencing my journal emails and the copies of voice messages I'd saved. They listened, took notes, and thanked me for being so thorough. Later that afternoon, I met with Mr. Everett to go over what the auditors had found so far. He pointed out the pattern, how Rachel's spending had increased dramatically in the months after Jason's death, how she'd used her access to shift money between accounts, and how the trust amendment had coincided with the first large withdrawals. "You've built a strong case, Elaine," he said. "Now we just need to see it through." I nodded, the reality settling in deeper. This wasn't just about money. It was about showing that my story mattered and that I was still capable of telling it. One evening, as the sun set behind the shelter's windows, I attended a group session led by a counselor named Teresa. She invited anyone who wanted to talk to share their story. I listened quietly at first, but when it was my turn, I found myself speaking clearly and steadily describing what had happened to me. The other women nodded, their faces kind and understanding. Afterward, Teresa pulled me aside and said, "You're doing the right thing. Sometimes, the smallest act, keeping good records, speaking up, can change everything." The court set a date for the next hearing, and Mr. Everett prepared a full report for the judge. He included every statement, every email, every recording. "You'll need to be ready to testify," he said. "But I'll be right beside you." I thanked him, feeling the weight of what was coming. The day before the hearing, I walked by the ocean, letting the salt air clear my thoughts. I stopped to watch the waves break along the sand, remembering all the years I'd stood beside Rachel through school, through marriage, through grief. I let the memory settle, and then turned back toward the city, ready for what would come next. The morning of the hearing arrived cool and bright. Margaret met me outside the courthouse, her arm warm around my shoulders as we waited for Mr. Everett. Inside, the courtroom felt familiar now. The same judge, the same worn wooden benches, the same echo of footsteps on tile. Rachel was there, sitting at the table with her attorney, her face composed, her eyes set ahead. Mr. Everett began with our opening statement, laying out the timeline of events. The auditors presented their findings, pointing to the transfers, the purchases, and the forged amendment. I took the stand, when called, answering the judge's questions, carefully explaining what I'd noticed, what I'd tried to do, and how I'd gathered the evidence. The judge listened closely, asking about the USB drive, the voice messages, and the physician's report. Rachel's attorney objected at points, but Mr. Everett responded calmly, supporting every answer with documentation. For the first time, as I sat in the witness chair, I didn't feel small or silenced. I felt prepared. I spoke about the years I'd spent helping others, balancing books, caring for family. I spoke about Rachel, about how I trusted her, and how that trust was taken advantage of. The judge thanked me, his voice measured but kind, and called for a recess while he reviewed the evidence. During the break, Margaret handed me a bottle of water. "Whatever happens next," she said, "you've already done more than most." I nodded, my hands steady, feeling a quiet resolve grow inside. As the hearing resumed, the judge announced that a full review would be completed before any final decisions. Rachel's face was unreadable as she left the courtroom. Mr. Everett assured me the hardest part was over, but there was still more to come. I walked out into the late afternoon, the courthouse steps warm from the sun, knowing that for the first time in a long while, I had truly spoken for myself. That evening, back at the shelter, I opened my journal and wrote down the day's events, line by line. I ended the entry with 3 words: I am ready. Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring, but tonight I was at peace with how far I'd come. The days after the last hearing felt both long and strangely weightless, as if every hour hung suspended between what had already happened and whatever was coming next. The shelter was quieter now that the weather had turned cold. I spent most mornings with my journal at the corner table, reviewing the audit notes, checking in with Mr. Everett, by phone waiting for the court to set the next date. Each time the phone rang, I wondered if it would be news, good or bad, but it was always Mr. Everett, steady as ever, reminding me what documents we might still need, telling me that the judge had requested even more records from Rachel's accounts. One afternoon, I received a call from the district attorney's office. The woman on the line introduced herself as Ms. Reynolds. She asked if I could bring everything, my notes, my USB drives, copies of statements, emails, all of it down to their office. That evening, I sorted every folder and envelope into a neat stack in my tote, careful to include even the smallest scraps of evidence. The next morning, I rode the bus across town. The district attorney's office was in a building I'd passed 100 times before but never entered. The security guard checked my name, and I waited in a chair by the front window until Ms. Reynolds called me back. Her office was plain but bright. A single picture on the wall, the desk covered in file folders, and a mug that read, "World's Okayest Lawyer." She listened as I explained each piece of evidence, stopping only to ask the occasional question, then carefully copied my files to her own drive. She thanked me for coming in. "You've done everything right, Mrs. Hastings," she said. "It isn't often we see a case this well documented." She explained that they'd be moving forward with a financial investigation of Rachel and asked if I'd be willing to testify again if needed. I said yes and gathered my things, feeling something shift inside, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air is heavy and expectant. A few days later, Mr. Everett called with an update. The court had finished reviewing the audit. He said the judge was troubled by the pattern of spending, and by the evidence in the USB and emails. The next hearing would include not just the trust, but possible criminal charges. He told me to be prepared that Rachel's attorney might try to delay, might argue she'd only acted out of concern, but that the evidence was on our side now. Margaret came by that evening, bringing chicken soup and fresh bread from her neighbor's bakery. We sat together in the tiny lounge off the shelter's kitchen. I told her about the DA's visit, the audit results, the new court date. She listened, nodding her eyes, steady and kind. "You're almost at the end of this, Elaine," she said. "I can feel it." For the first time, I almost believed her. The day before the hearing, I laid out everything I would need: my journal, copies of statements, the doctor's letter, the USB. I pressed my skirt, set out my good scarf, and tried to sleep. In the early morning, I took the bus to the courthouse, the city still gray and quiet, my breath clouding in the cold air. Margaret met me outside, her arm around my shoulders. "You're not alone," she said. Not today. Inside the courtroom felt even colder than before. Rachel was already there, her lawyer at her side, her face pale but set. The DA entered with Ms. Reynolds and another attorney carrying a stack of files. The judge arrived, and everyone stood. The hearing began first with the court's review of the audit. The DA laid out the timeline: every unauthorized withdrawal, every transfer, the trust amendment, the Tesla payment, the department store splurges. She read aloud portions of Rachel's messages, her own words about doing Mom a favor and covering up the mess. Rachel's attorney objected several times, but the judge allowed most of the evidence. When it was my turn, I took the witness stand, hands folded together. The judge asked direct questions. Did I remember signing the trust amendment? Did I ever give Rachel permission to take control of my accounts? Was I aware of the large withdrawals? I answered each one carefully, never raising my voice, but never looking away. Rachel avoided my eyes, staring at her own hands. When the DA asked if I felt coerced or pressured by Rachel, I simply told the truth. I trusted my daughter, and that trust had been taken advantage of. Rachel's lawyer tried to paint a different picture, that she was grieving, overwhelmed, acting only out of love. But when the judge asked for evidence, the audit and messages spoke louder than any defense. Finally, the judge said she would rule at the end of the day. Court recessed, and I stepped outside into the hallway, Margaret beside me. She squeezed my hand, and we sat quietly waiting for the call back. Late that afternoon, the judge reconvened. Her words were steady, deliberate. She found that Rachel had used her power as co-trustee to commit financial exploitation and fraud. She ruled that Rachel was to be removed from any control over the trust or my accounts, and she referred the evidence to the district attorney for further charges. Rachel's attorney asked for leniency, saying Rachel's children depended on her, but the judge stood firm. The order would stand. Rachel didn't look up as the judge finished reading. She only nodded, her face pale, her lips pressed tight together. Outside the courthouse, the air felt lighter. I hugged Margaret. Mr. Everett shook my hand. "You did it, Elaine," he said. I walked back to the shelter, the city lights glowing as dusk fell, thinking about the long road behind me and the new one ahead. That night, I opened my journal and wrote down the judge's words, copying them carefully. As I closed the book, I felt the weight of the years ease just a little. Tomorrow would bring new steps talks, with the DA figuring out what comes next for the trust, and maybe, just maybe, a chance to begin again. The days following the judge's ruling moved quietly, almost gently, as if the world itself was giving me space to breathe again. There was relief in knowing Rachel couldn't touch my accounts or the trust. But there was still a long road ahead, one last hearing, a meeting with the district attorney, and all the loose ends that follow when justice starts to take shape. Mr. Everett called every morning to check in and let me know what to expect. Margaret visited with flowers or a homemade pie, each visit anchoring me back to the simple comforts I'd almost forgotten. One afternoon, the district attorney's office called. Ms. Reynolds asked if I'd be willing to testify again, this time at a formal hearing where Rachel's actions would be reviewed for criminal charges and restitution. I agreed. The next few days were spent gathering all my records, bank statements, the USB drives, the doctor's letter, and every note from my journal. Margaret helped me sort through everything at her kitchen table, the two of us working quietly until every page was in place. The day of the hearing arrived with a gray sky and a soft drizzle. I dressed with care and rode the bus downtown, my bag heavy with documents, my heart steady. Margaret met me at the courthouse doors, her umbrella tilted over both our heads. "You don't have to do this alone," she said, and walked beside me all the way in. The courtroom was different this time, more crowded, more formal, with a panel of officials at the front, and the district attorney seated across from Rachel and her lawyer. Rachel's children, Emily and Jacob, sat quietly in the gallery. I glanced at them as I took my seat. They looked lost, unsure where to turn. I wished I could offer comfort, but all I could do was focus on what needed to be said. The district attorney opened by laying out the evidence, every transaction, every unauthorized purchase, every piece of documentation showing Rachel's pattern of control. She played the voice recordings, read aloud Rachel's emails, and presented the audit findings. The judge listened in silence, making notes as each new detail was revealed. Rachel's attorney tried to argue that Rachel had acted out of desperation, that she was overwhelmed and grieving, but the evidence spoke for itself. When it was my turn, I took the witness stand, my hands resting lightly on the wood. The judge asked me questions about my relationship with Rachel, how I'd discovered the missing funds, how I'd gathered proof. I answered each one as simply and clearly as I could, describing what it felt like to lose not just my savings, but my sense of trust and safety. The room was silent when I finished. The judge thanked me and called Rachel to the stand. Rachel's testimony was quiet, her words halting. She spoke about Jason's death, the bills that followed, and how she'd tried to keep the family afloat. But when the prosecutor produced documents showing she'd used my money for personal luxuries and forged my signature on trust amendments, Rachel had no answers. She lowered her head and didn't speak again. The district attorney asked the judge for a formal order of restitution and recommended that Rachel be barred from handling any family member's finances in the future. The judge agreed, issuing a ruling that Rachel repay the stolen funds in structured payments and serve a period of house arrest with counseling and community service. The courtroom was still as the sentence was read. The only sound, a quiet gasp from Emily in the gallery. As I left the witness stand, Emily approached me, her face streaked with tears. "Grandma, I'm so sorry," she whispered. I put my arms around her and held her for a long moment, feeling the weight of everything we'd both lost, and everything that might someday be rebuilt. Outside, Margaret waited by the courthouse steps. We walked together to the cafe on the corner, neither of us saying much, just sharing a pot of tea as the rain tapped gently on the windows. When we parted, she pressed my hand and said, "You stood up for yourself, Elaine. You showed all of us what's possible." That night, I returned to the shelter for the last time, packing my things into a small suitcase. The staff wished me well, Mrs. Riley slipping a card and a bag of cookies into my hand. "You're stronger than you know," she said, her smile gentle. Back in my room, I sat one last time at the little desk, writing a final entry in my journal. The words came quietly, steady, and sure. Tomorrow, I would move into a new place, not grand, but mine, with my own name on the door and sunlight in the window. The long fight was finally ending, and as I closed the journal, I knew that peace, however quiet, was finally coming home. My first morning in the new apartment, I woke to sunlight drifting through curtains I'd picked out myself. The room was small, but filled with the kind of quiet that feels earned. I moved slowly, setting out a favorite mug, placing a few photos along the windowsill. George's smile. Rachel as a little girl and the grandchildren on a windy day at the shore. The past few months still felt close, every detail clear, as if it had happened just yesterday. But in that gentle light, the sharpness of it all had softened. I could breathe again. Later, I took a walk down to the beach, the same stretch of sand where George and I used to bring Rachel when she was small. The air was cool, the waves steady, and I let myself feel the rhythm of my own steps steady, certain no longer waiting for the next blow. I watched families setting out picnic blankets, little ones running at the water's edge. For a moment, I thought about how much had been lost and how much had quietly endured. Over the next weeks, I settled into routines that belonged to me alone. I learned the names of neighbors who greeted me in the hallway, found a local book club at the library, even started volunteering a few mornings a week. My days were simple, but they were mine, filled with small kindnesses and the slow rebuilding of trust in the world and in myself. Rachel called only once, her voice hesitant. She apologized haltingly, uncertain of what to say now that the old rules were gone. I listened quietly, told her I wished her well, and let her know that her children were always welcome to visit. Emily and Jacob came by a few times, their visits shy at first, but warmer each time. We baked cookies together, played board games, and sat in the sun talking about their favorite books. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, a new beginning, shaped by hard lessons learned. I kept in touch with Margaret, who never let me forget how much strength it takes to choose dignity over comfort. Sometimes we'd meet at the same cafe, sharing a quiet smile over tea and remembering all that we'd survived. Mr. Everett called now and then just to make sure I was settled and the trust was safe. The shelter staff sent a postcard wishing me well. In every corner of this new life, I found reminders that justice isn't always loud, but it is always possible. Looking back, I see now that the hardest part wasn't losing money or being betrayed by someone I loved. It was learning how to stand up for myself quietly, steadily, without losing the softness that makes life worth living. I hope that if someone hears my story, they'll remember that even when it feels like everything is being taken from you, there is still something inside that can't be stolen. Your voice, your worth, your ability to begin again. So wherever you're listening from, I hope you'll take a moment to check in on someone who might need a little extra kindness, or simply remember, you're never too old to start over. If this story meant something to you, I'd be glad to hear your thoughts or memories. And if you'd like to hear more stories like mine, you're welcome to join me again next time. Thank you for listening and for believing that justice and dignity belong to all of us at any age and at every stage of life.